This is People and Their Poems, a podcast about the poems that make a difference in our world. In each episode, writer and educator Sandy Carlson talks with a person who has been influenced by poetry and become a poet or a supporter of this literary form. Stay tuned.
Welcome to People and Their Poems podcast, a podcast about local poets and the poems that matter to them. I'm here today with Jessica Cuello. She is editor of the Tahoma Review and has been a French and English teacher in the public schools for 27 years. Her books include Liar, Yours, Creature, Hunt, and Pricking. Welcome, Jessica, to People and Their Poems podcast.
Thank you for having me.
I've had the pleasure of reading your poetry and enjoy the range of it, but would you introduce yourself to our listeners as a poet?
I don't have a whole lot more to add than what you've shared. I'm a voracious reader, which informs my poetry more than anything else. And I've been writing since I was 5, but I didn't start trying to publish seriously until about 10 years ago. And then my books sort of have come out in a very quick succession, as if they've been dammed up inside me. But I've considered myself a poet long before I published, and I don't think publishing is the marker for being a poet, but it's been nice. I've had all these books come out in the last 5 years, and I have a book, The Yours Creature, comes out this May from JackLeg Press, and it's a book of epistolary poems in the voice of Mary Shelley.
That's very cool. I can't wait to hear more about your Mary Shelley collection, but could we just back it up a little bit? You said you've been writing since you were 5 years old. What was your first writing experience? What do you remember of your early realizations as a child that you wanted to write?
I always had kept diaries pretty diligently. And when I finally made a very close friend, which took me a long time, when I moved to Syracuse, New York, I grew up in Geneva, New York, and I was quite lonely there. So I had all of these journals. I used to create, I think I was an editor early on too, because I used to create these magazine subscriptions and then try to give them to old lady neighbors and my parents and brother. So I think I saw myself as an editor before I knew what being an editor was. And I wrote short stories about imaginary creatures. And then my best friend from 8th grade, we're still very close. She and I would have journals that we wrote to each other and back and forth. So the epistolary form has always been a part of my life too, writing letters to people.
When you were writing those letters to your friend, did that experience in any way compare to what passes for epistolary writing nowadays in terms of email and social media, or was it a different kind of thought process that you engaged your friend through writing?
I think it's different from email because it's so tactile. And we were careful about choosing the books, and some had cloth covers and some had art. And then we would add quotes and song lyrics in the back in little squares, and we would draw pictures. And sometimes we would tape things in, little notes. So it was a whole process of our friendship during a year. And I think I have always been a person who communicated more readily in writing than speaking. And so even a podcast, I get kind of nervous, but I know it's good for me to do it because I think it's a really important kind of community. And I think it's also helped me think about my process in a different way, having to answer questions aloud. So I answered your question and then I went somewhere else.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. When I was growing up, I corresponded with my grandmothers as well as a great uncle. And my great uncle lived on the other side of town. I grew up in Danbury, Connecticut. And my grandmother was in Darien, Connecticut, and the other one was down in Florida. I'm just relating to what you're saying because we bought each other stationery. My grandmother's made gifts of stamps to me, so I had this autonomy about when I was mailing them as a little kid. But opening that mailbox and seeing that sort of old-fashioned penmanship, I still have those letters, and I open them up, and it's like like they just wrote them. And it's so deeply personal in a way that email isn't, because email always has the potential for having a vast public audience if it because it lives in the ether.
And you can't touch it. I feel that I've had relationships via letters I've had so many, and I could almost narrate my life through the mail. In fact, even to this day, when I see the mailman, my heart kind of leaps up, as it gives me a thrill, because I associate mailmen with, it's like librarians, there's something beautiful, and they're bringing letters, although I don't get many letters anymore. I even befriended, when I was a little girl, there was this old man in my church, and I just thought he was really cute, and I thought he had a beautiful face. So I reached out to him, and we became friends. And then I wrote to him all the way through college until he died, and he would write back. And it's just one of those unusual friendships. And then, of course, I was telling my students the other day, we were talking about correspondence, and I was telling them how I had love letters. Love letters came up in something in class, and they really didn't know what that was or understand that it was a thing. And I remember I told them in college, when I was abroad in Paris, we had no phones, we had no computers, and you're completely cut off from your own country. And we would all gather on Friday at the end of the hall, where there was this box where all the letters that had come in would be filed alphabetically. And you would just pray that you would get a letter, and we'd hover around that box hoping to get a letter.
The beautiful art form, it's so touching. It's funny, I was reading, oh golly, in one of the writing magazines about how writers should get off the grid and generate paper, basically to have a paper legacy, which is, speaks to the artifice of the social media and the pretense that's out there right now, that immediate, here it is. But it does recognize the importance of the written word and the time it takes to put them on the page and to send them to somebody to be read. So that's interesting that has informed your experience of writing. Is there a writer whose style is epistolary that has influenced you, or what writers were influencing you as a young person?
As a young person, when I think about the Mary Shelley book, it was actually most influenced by Lucy Brock-Broido's book, The Master Letters. And it's funny, I don't even think of that for its epistolary nature. In fact, this is the first time I've really thought aloud or in my interior about the epistolary part. I was more drawn to the elliptical nature of, it's a book about Emily Dickinson's letters, and it makes a lot of giant leaps. That's her style of writing. And I think I was very drawn to, my book doesn't end up being like her, the way it is when you imitate someone, you end up still sounding like yourself. But that was the book I think that influenced me most for the Mary Shelley. And then I read a lot of biographies about Shelley and also her mom, Mary Wollstonecraft. I wrote that book very quickly, kind of in a rush, after I had read multiple biographies, which doesn't happen always. It was just a gift. It wasn't a book I had planned on writing.
What drew you to Mary Shelley?
I think the idea of the monster, the monstrosity, and I think her experience as a mother and a lover, her life is pretty extraordinary.
And in her time, she was quite a force.
Yes. Well, she suffered so much. And Frankenstein is epistolary. I think people forget that it begins. And you forget once you get engaged with the story, I always forget how it begins. You forget that you're reading a letter.
Because we're so caught up in the world of the monster, right? And the actual experience. But then it also speaks to the power of the letter to bring us into a world, not our own. Could you talk a little bit about your poetry and the very various influences that have kind of come into your life that have shaped your writing? But would you just talk a little bit about the audience you have for that?
Sure. I think my audience may be narrow. I think it's always narrow for poetry, but I wonder if even among poets it's narrow, which doesn't actually bother me too much, because I feel that's how our audience is as people too. Only some people will get you, and that's okay. Each of the books that I've written, it's been in a very different place, and it has come from very different books. And even from book to book, there have been drastic changes in my reading patterns. So the last book I just wrote, Liar, is probably the most personal of my 4 books. And it's written as persona in the voice of children. And it also has autobiographical poems. I guess some of the poets I've been reading and loving, Diane Seuss, Shane McRae, Natalie Diaz, Jane Springer, Philip Metras, Layli Long Soldier, Ruth Stone, Katie Peterson. You know, when I always am hesitant to say the poets that influence me, because mainly I'm influenced by people's craft and skill, not necessarily what they're doing. Sometimes I'm copying what other people are doing, but mainly I'm admiring people who are being true to their voice or their book, because it gives you the freedom to do what you want to do. So I guess I don't really think this has influenced me or that has influenced me directly, but I'm influenced by artists. My second book was kind of a feminist Moby Dick, about the absent feminine voices in Moby Dick, the sea, the creatures, the women at home. And that book came out of a Frank Stella art exhibit where he had a sculpture in response to the different chapters of Moby Dick. And it just moved me so much. And it was a book I had already loved. So influence is a strange thing how it works. And I think I don't always understand it. And maybe I'm even reluctant to talk about it, because it sounds cliche to say that there's a mysterious nature to the process, but sometimes it's one I don't like to tap into too closely until it's at a distance and I can look back.
That makes sense. And maybe that's very ancient wisdom, this notion of the muses speaking through us, the way the poems, I think, can find their writer as well. When we're in tune with the moment, experiencing an art exhibit, reading something very compelling, like the biographies of Mary Shelley and those things, just kind of.
Yeah, I don't like to mess with that. I recognize it when it comes. I know what it is. I know when something is a poem. I know when something has the potential. When I'm thinking too much and trying too hard, it might be well crafted, but there's no life beneath it. There's no electric pulse. Right. There's a lot of beautifully crafted poems, but I don't keep reading them. So I don't mean to dismiss the process of editing and drafting, but there's this other process that people talk about less recently, it seems. I think because you can't incorporate it into a program, you can't bring it into the whole professionalism of writing. And right now, writing is the engine of the whole poetry world, is conferences and degrees and master classes. And if there's this other part, this undefinable part that is equally as important as learning what a pantoum is or learning about line breaks, which all of those things are important, but it's not all that it is. And I like to guard that piece of it. And I teach my students to guard that part of it, because I do think that's where great poems come from, that impulse. And then you can bring in your craft and your knowledge.
Right. This notion of the psyche or the soul that can't be quantified, that resists categorization or being put in some kind of academic box, as if you can earn it, if you do the right courses in your MFA program.
Yes. And I'm always drawn to voices that sound like they're coming from another place, that surprise.
Right. And can you, as a French and English teacher for almost 3 decades, I noticed that you've done a lot of translation work. Can you just speak to that? What draws you to translation?
So my answer is very unsexy. It's actually this is a very new field for me. And I started getting an MFA recently during COVID because I felt that yearning for the community. I wanted to be more integrated with other poets, and I wasn't. And it seemed like something I could do. But when I approached my school superintendent about sort of covering some of the costs and also about getting a pay bump, because how teachers, when we do I'm teaching French. I don't teach English anymore. So it was hard to sort of argue. And she said, well, what about this translation certificate? I think if you do the translation, you can definitely fit it into your career. So that's partly what led me to the translation. Was it gave me a pay bump and helped me cover the cost. And then turns out I loved it. I loved it. I loved it in ways that were surprising to me. It didn't turn out to be what I thought it would be, even though I had done some translation with my upper level French students. And now I've been adding units for my seniors in French 5 also to do translation.
Yeah, I remember years ago being in the west of Ireland and had the opportunity to hear the Irish poet Cathal O'Sharkey read his poems in his native Irish, and somebody who was a native English speaker read the translations, and his point being that a poem in translation is a different poem. Mm-hmm. And he welcomed that. That's what got him a wider audience than the Gaeilgeoirs of Western Ireland. Do you and we talking about the sort of the creative muse that won't be labeled and boxed or quantified. What's it like to enter into somebody else's work in another language and to sort of occupy the experience of the poem?
I was afraid to ruin their work. I was afraid to touch their work. But I'm also a person that is hesitant to enter groups. And I'm hesitant, I talk about how I like to communicate by writing. Teaching is so different because you're in charge, and so a classroom for me is always one of the safest places. But in general, I'm very hesitant to be close to other people. And I translated this book, Pendant que Perceval tombait, by the poet Tania Longley. She's a Quebecoise poet, and she's a living poet. And it's a book-length poem. It's a beautiful book about Virginia Woolf's last day.
Oh, goodness.
And it's incredible. It's spare, lyrical, quite experimental, repetitive. It's like pieces. The poem is in fragments that almost could be moved around. And I was very drawn to this book. So I started translating it during the pandemic. And then my mentor in my MFA program said, well, you have to reach out to the poet. I was so afraid to do it. And it turned out to be wonderful. And she was wondrous and loving. And we had the best conversation. So it was a big growing experience for me about the community of poetry, which is the part I'm still learning. The first time I published a group from that book, it was in the Los Angeles Review, and I let the poet know, and she said, well, I want to read them. So I was terrified. I sent them to her, and she loved them. And she said, I heard her voice in her head. And she, she's Canadian, so she's super nice. And she's like, oh, they sound better in English. They're better than my own, which they are not. But she was very lovely. And it was this huge sigh of relief that the poems pleased her. And I don't know if all translators have that. That's just my makeup as a human being, that I wanted the poet to love the work.
That must have been very gratifying for her as well, that you occupied her poem for the time it took you to translate it. And
it was, and that was the part that was a lesson to me. When we had a Zoom meeting, and it was really clear how important it was to her that I had done this. That taught me. I had to, if you get so absorbed in your own fear of doing something and how you're going to screw up, you're not listening to someone else. You're not hearing what someone else needs. That this is really about her work and honoring her work and doing justice to her work. And if I'm focused on that and taking the time to see her and know her as a person, then all that worry is just, it evaporates.
Right.
So that was the lesson for me, that I had been too caught up in my own fear about the process.
That's interesting. I mean, early in our conversation, you talked about publishing being the less important part of the creative process, and that letters really do engage a very, very selective audience, the recipient. this has been my experience of poetry in community, that it becomes this one-on-one experience. And when a person is reading, it's one-on-one with each of the people listening. And it is a very personal thing. And that just sounds like a tremendous experience. Would you mind reading some of your work so that our listeners can hear your poetic voice as well as your very poetic prose voice?
Sure. You know how you had the question about a poem that influenced me?
Right.
I did pick one. Do you want me to do that first, or do you want to bypass that part?
No, let's do both. I think that would be very nice to put them in conversation with each other.
Okay. I got a question about a poem that one of the first poems I read that influenced me. And, I mentioned I grew up reading a lot and hearing a lot of music. The question took me to a beloved 10th grade English teacher, Kay Kasperger, who was the era of rock star English teachers, where I think so many of us had these women English teachers from another time who were so brilliant and so well read and could have done anything, except that they grew up in a time where there were not a lot of options. You could be a nurse, you could be a teacher, you could get married. So many people benefited from this woman. And I kept in touch with her later. She sent me her curriculum, which was extraordinary, so ahead of its time. But I remember in her class, she would hand out these poems that were typed on her typewriter. All of her materials had the same font and that typewriter font and look. And I kept them for years. They were so beautiful. And I remember I got the poem Out, Out by Robert Frost.
Oh, wow.
When I saw the question, a poem that influenced me, this poem just came to me, and I've never thought about. I still remember sitting in the row in her classroom, the sunlight coming in, holding the poem in my hand. And I remember how I felt, and I remember images and lines, and I remember why. I didn't understand why the poem touched me, but I did connect it to one of my poems now that I have that, talking about having a distance to look back. So I will read the poem. It's Out, Out, Robert Frost. The buzzsaw snarled and rattled in the yard and made dust and dropped stove-length sticks of wood, sweet scented stuff when the breeze drew across it. And from there, those that lifted eyes could count 5 mountain ranges, one behind the other, under the sunset far into Vermont. And the saw snarled and rattled, as it ran light or had to bear a load. And nothing happened. Day was all but done. Call it a day, I wish they might have said, to please the boy by giving him the half hour that a boy counts so much when saved from work. His sister stood beside him in her apron to tell them supper. At the word, the saw, as if to prove saws knew what supper meant, leaped out at the boy's hand, or seemed to leap. He must have given the hand. However it was, neither refused the meeting, but the hand. The boy's first outcry was a rueful laugh, as he swung toward them, holding up the hand, half in appeal, but half as if to keep the life from spilling. Then the boy saw all, since he was old enough to know, big boy, doing a man's work, though a child at heart. He saw all spoiled. Don't let him cut my hand off, the doctor, when he comes. Don't let him, sister. So, but the hand was gone already. The doctor put him in the dark of ether. He lay and puffed his lips out with his breath, and then the watcher at his pulse took fright. No one believed. They listened at his heart. Little, less, nothing. And that ended it. No more to build on there. And they, since they were not the one dead, turned to their affairs. So that was the first poem I read that was like that. And I think what startled me was how dark it was. And I received that darkness like a gift, because I think kids are very aware of darkness.
Right.
I knew darkness. I knew a world with darkness in it. but I had never seen it acknowledged. I hadn't seen it acknowledged in print, least of all. So it was this like, oh, others know that this is a thing. I mean, I'd read it in novels, but I think poetry has such a more visceral, immediate feel. And then the fact that there was a boy, and the boy in the poem also understands that he's doing a man's work, but he's still a boy, but he understands he's going to lose his hand and die. And then I also just, the personification of the saw, I remember, struck me. I think that's probably the first time I encountered, that literary device
Right.
in such a powerful way. And then, thinking about why this poem stayed with me, and I haven't thought back to that class until this podcast, I realize now, almost 30 years later, that it's because of the sister and the presence of the sister, and that the sister is an observer to the brother's pain, but she's almost invisible. And I think, I identified with that girl presence, and I think that's something a lot of girls do. I think Marie Howe's poem, The Boy, about the son who refuses to cut his hair, and the sister follows him to make peace between him and the father, and that defines the protagonist in the poem, that it defined her as someone who would follow after others. And I think there's this piece of girlhood, especially from a certain generation, of observing, not being the central character, but being a witness to the pain of someone else. So I thought I would go from there to one of the poems in my book, Liar. This book came out last fall, 2021. And this is a poem about a brother and sister. That's what occurred to me about that Robert Frost poem. There are the other things I mentioned, but I realized that was the part of it that I think touched me the most, although I didn't understand that when I was 14. Limbo. I draw an eye on my notebook, a swirl of ink. I'm not sure whose, but it sees me when my brother can't. He lives with us, but died somewhere back in childhood. He won't say how. His limbs move well enough to walk to school and back. I've seen his vacant eye, seen him in the hallway in his same sweatshirt. He won't pronounce my name. He skips the I. He shuts his door. We once were close, walked hand in hand. Pre-language, we shared a bed. My notebook eye is more alive than he. Grain of paper, welt of ink. It sees more than a dead boy. And because he does alive things, like sleep and eat, I can't mourn.
Oh my goodness. I'm so glad things flowed the way they did, to see those two poems in side by side, to hear the girl's voice. When you were speaking, you talked about women of a certain generation, and I remember I grew up in the 80s, and I had two parents who came out of the Depression, who saw the depredations of the Second World War, and had a very high standard of what we had a right to complain about, and so children didn't see darkness. They did their homework. And to have Robert Frost open that up for a young person, and have such an insightful English teacher make that available to her students, is encouraging, inspiring, and just to see where you took it in your poem.
She was very special. She had us reading in the 80s, Etheridge Night.
Ooh.
And we did a war unit. We saw Picasso's Guernica. I mean, Wilfred Owen. She was an extraordinary person, and we knew it, even though kids don't always know that, but we knew it. We knew she was special.
If she could have foreseen this moment, your poetry and the gift of your art and the humanism in your writing and in your thinking, and just respect for the creative process. I wish I could go take your French class in New York, and and enter that world and be a student again in that environment that she nurtured way back when. Little did she know.
Yeah.
And I'm going to spend more time reading your work. Where can our listeners, if they want to engage your poetry and read more of your very excellent work, where can they find you online?
They can go to my website, Jessica Cuello, CUELLO.com. And there are poems there. There are places to order books. My book, Liar, that I just read Limbo from, is on the Barrow Street Press website. And the Mary Shelley book that's forthcoming is JackLeg Press. But I will have all those books on my website. They're there now, except for the Mary Shelley book. And small press distribution. Also, if you just put my name in, that's another place to buy books.
Got it. And I know there's such an amazing sampling of your work on the website as well. So we'll make sure all those links are in the podcast notes. Thank you so much for your time today, Jessica. Appreciate your being a part of People and Their Poems.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your questions.
This has been People and Their Poems, a podcast about the poems that make a difference in our world. Be sure to check the show notes for any special links relating to this episode. If you want to learn more about the podcast, visit peopleandtheirpoems.net. Or if you want to learn more about Sandy and her work, visit sandycarlson.net. Thanks for listening.